Good afternoon, and thank you for having us today join you to talk about how investors are driving change in construction and ensuring businesses are addressing carbon and climate change. It's a really interesting topic and very poignant this year in the race to the big UN conference at the end in Glasgow. My name's Sonia Bonsley. I'm Regional Director for Corporations at CDP, and I'm delighted to be joined by Claire Ailsden, our UK Director for Capital Markets. And we'll be talking to you a little bit about investors and the race to zero today. Okay, just for those of you who don't know, I'd like to do a quick introduction to who is CDP. CDP is a not-for-profit organisation that is over 20 years old. We were founded on the premise that transparency will lead to action. If we look back to 2 decades ago, we could see that climate change was increasingly starting to affect corporations and that we needed to take systemic change to really tackle this issue. So CDP founders got together with a small group of investors and said, what are you doing about this? And what the investor community told us very clearly is we need a standardized disclosure for climate change so that we can better understand what companies are doing, benchmark them against each other, and then engage with them to drive positive climate action. We started off very small, but we've grown since then. We now work with over 590 investors who represent an astonishing $110 trillion in assets under management. We also work with 200 large purchasers from around the world who have a combined purchasing power of 5.5 trillion. These two groups ask in excess of 15,000 companies to disclose their climate information to CDP every year. And last year, despite COVID and all the disruption that we've seen, over 9,600 companies reported to CDP, which we're phenomenally proud of. So that's a bit of a background to who we are. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Claire, who's going to talk to you a bit about investors and their interest in climate change and what they're doing with corporations at the moment. Claire.
Great, thank you, Sonia, and also good to be here today. So first, I just want to set the scene in terms of defining what we're actually talking about when we say investors. So in a CDP context, historically, that would have meant primarily equity investors, so that's asset managers and asset owners. But about 2 years ago, our team went through a phase of reimagining and really thinking much more broadly about how does capital flow throughout the economy and how do we need to be present to inform the various actors throughout that economy. So what am I talking about specifically? I'm talking about banks, insurers, and fixed income investors in particular, so people who invest in bonds, as well as credit ratings agencies, venture capital investors, private equity, and others. So I think it's really important to understand how the landscape has shifted, particularly the last 18 months, because as Sonia alluded to at the beginning here, we've seen a period of rapid change. So first of all, from a regulatory perspective, you may or may not be aware that last year, the beginning of last year, Bank of England announced a new exercise that the banks would have to undertake. This was really applying to the 6 largest banks in the UK, as well as a suite of insurers as well. But this was for the very first time, the request was made of these banks to respond to an exercise, which was a climate-related stress test exercise. You might remember a good 10 years ago now, during the financial crash, there was a lot of stress testing of balance sheets going on to understand what a shock to the economy in general would do to banks' balance sheets. This exercise, though, is unique and different insofar as it's challenging banks to think about what's going to be the impact on your balance sheet, on your corporate lending portfolios, to the impacts of climate change under 3 different scenarios. Now, this was a very ambitious project when it was first announced, as you can see here. The banks involved were requested to provide data on up to 80% of their corporate portfolios. So per bank, that could have been anywhere up to 10,000 companies that they were seeking disclosure from. And that point about seeking disclosure is critical. Model data wasn't going to be enough for this exercise. It depended on the banks reaching out directly to the companies that they lend to, which could even be some of the companies, and probably is many of the companies that are actually dialing into this call today. And there was a request for all kinds of TCFD aligned data to be reported back to those banks. Now, some of you might be sitting here thinking, well, I was never contacted. Well, the reason for that, and next slide, please, is because in the end on this specific incident, just before Christmas last year, the Bank of England realised that perhaps for various reasons, not least COVID, but also just the enormity of trying to coordinate this exercise amongst 6 banks under really rapid timescales, doing something this innovative and new was probably just a step too much on this one occasion. So the Bank of England actually descaled the exercise and reduce the scope so that the focus of this exercise was essentially, and there's more detail on the slide on the right there, but the top 150 corporate counterparties of any bank. So as you can imagine, a lot of those relationships are in place, and the banks in their different ways use different mechanisms to try to reach out to those companies in future. So why am I mentioning it now? Well, if we could go to the next slide, please. What I think is very relevant is that, firstly, although that was one exercise on one occasion, the Bank of England have never said that they wouldn't repeat the exercise, and certainly speaking to the banks on a regular basis, which CDP certainly does, we understand that there is an assumption being made by most of the banks and insurers that this is an exercise that likely will be repeated, could even become over time an annually recurring event. And suffice to say, that original scale of the ambition is something that likely the Bank of England will return to. So all this to say, for companies on the call today, trying to think about, okay, well, what's this mean for me? Most likely over the next couple of years, you may well be hearing from the bank that provides your financing to say, we need you to provide some reported data so that we can understand what will happen to your business under different climate scenarios. So that's something to really have on the radar. This isn't just something that's affecting the UK market, though. We've also been seeing from our conversations that we're having across Asia that we're likely to see a very similar exercise come into force across Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan. And in May this year, we heard from the Biden administration that they issued an executive order giving Janet Yellen 6 months to recommend steps to reduce the risk to financial stability posed by climate change. All that to say, it's probably coming through from the Fed as well. So I think that's a really important backdrop to understand from a regulatory perspective. Moving on to the next slide, please. There's another aspect to all of this. As Sonia alluded to in the beginning, there's a huge conversation going on, especially in the lead up to COP, about the race to zero. Now, what this means in the broader sense of the investors, like I referred to earlier, so equity investors, asset owners, banks, and more, is that all of them are setting ambitious net zero targets. There are different approaches for doing this depending on what segment the investor type falls into. So, for example, we've been hearing from the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative that 128 signatories have signed up, representing 43 trillion of assets under management. Similarly, for the Net Zero Banking Alliance, 45 banks as of May this year from 24 countries, representing over $29 trillion in assets, committed to align their lending and investment portfolios with net zero emissions by 2050. There are similar stats for the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. So big commitments are being set. But again, what does this mean for the companies who are dialing into this call? Well, again, it's likely to come back to disclosure, because if we could hop to the next slide, please. There is a real need for data to underpin all of these analyses. So whether a bank or an asset manager or an asset owner is trying to understand at a glance, what is the state of the emissions profile of my portfolio today, whether it's a lending portfolio or an investment portfolio or something else? What are the emissions looking like of these companies today? But also, what are the transition plans of these companies? Have they set a science-based target? We always really hope so. It's in our view, the absolute highest quality way to commit to action and to have that approved by the Science-Based Targets Initiative Board. But are there any other commitments that have been set out there? We're seeing this huge rush for data. And like I said before, it's really all about reported data that's coming direct from the companies themselves. Now, one challenge to this is many companies will say to us, but why do we necessarily need to disclose through CDP to do that? Why can't we just, we already make some sort of disclosure through our annual report or through our sustainability report. Are you asking me to do something beyond that? And the answer is actually yes. The reason for that is that we're hearing this from banks and asset managers, etc. alike. It's hugely problematic for these groups to have to firstly try to trawl the internet to find these hugely disparate releases that have been made by corporates in different formats and in different releases. It's a really difficult exercise that I don't think any of those counterparties has managed to crack yet. So it's very time consuming and problematic. And for some, they're saying that actually, unless we see disclosure coming through from our investee companies into a platform like CDP, it's going to be very hard for us to continue investing in these companies because these disclosures are critical. The second part of that is these disclosures need to be comparable and consistent, because it's really hard to understand how company A compares to company B when they're using different timeframes, different metrics, different measures. So I can't really compare which company is on track to hit a 1.5 degree scenario and which isn't. So that important takeaway really from all of this is it's critical for all of these actors. So whether you're a listed company, whether you've issued fixed income, or whether you simply have relationships with your banks, or all three, it's absolutely critical that you're making these disclosures, preferably to CDP, in this consistent, comparable, annually updated fashion, because this need and these binding commitments that we're seeing coming through from these banks, asset managers, asset owners, and more are going to mean that over time, it is absolutely mission critical to them that they receive this data. Otherwise, over time, it's going to impact the way in which they can do business with you. On the flip side, though, if the more data you provide, the more transition planning you provide, the more opportunities there will be for companies that do that to secure sustainability-linked lending and to really outperform and see strong attraction from equity and fixed income capital. I'll leave it there, but it's been a pleasure to describe this to you, and I'll hand it back to Sonia.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. It's always so mind-boggling to when I present with you all those massive numbers. I am just going to talk to you for 4 more minutes, just a bit about how UK construction, from what we've seen at CDP, is responding to all this change and all this emphasis coming from the stakeholders, such as the banks and the investment community. So, quick stock take of where we are. 16 companies, some of the biggest companies, construction companies in the UK, are reporting to CDP out of, we think, around 24 that were invited. We are seeing the construction companies increasing. This is relatively new. We're seeing more transparency from the construction industry in the last 3 years than we had in the probably decade that we had been working with them before. We've even seen 2 go on to get an A grade from CDP. To be clear on the A's, we assess in excess of 9,600 companies every year, probably about under 200, I would imagine this year, receive an A. It's a very difficult thing to receive, so it really does represent the leadership globally. Berkeley Group and Morgan Sindall, if any of you are on this particular conference today, achieved their A. But I also wanted to note a note out to Barratt Developments and Crest Nicholson and ISG, who got A minuses, so very close. So they're responding, the construction industry is responding to this increased demand from investors by being increasingly transparent. But Claire touched upon this briefly earlier. This year, the UK is hosting the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. That's when Biden and Johnson and all the global leaders get together to talk about climate change. And it's being hosted in Glasgow this year. It's on our home territory. So there is a new campaign called Race to Zero, which a lot of corporations on a global basis are really joining to communicate to these policymakers they want to see more action, and they're supportive of this. Now, to join Race to Zero, there's various different campaigns, but the one I really wanted to talk about was the Science Based Targets Initiative. Over 1,500 companies have set science-based targets. This campaign was launched at Paris 5 years ago and has really gained traction. I'm going to summarize it in a very simple way. It's a move from companies setting targets that they think they can achieve or they think are ambitious to targets that they know are aligned with the action needed from the science community. They're aligned to a 1.5 degree world. I think that's a really important step. It gives corporations the confidence to say that we are taking the necessary steps to play our role in this big global transition. So this particular campaign has gained traction. Now, what it requires is companies making a public commitment to set a target that aligns their emissions to a 1.5 degree world, which is exactly what the scientific community is demanding of us. It's quite a simple process to go through. You commit to setting a target aligned to 1.5 degrees. You join Race to Zero, and then you have a couple of years to work out exactly what that target is. You then submit this target to a not-for-profit organization that's called a Science-Based Targets Initiative. I won't go into the details of that. They assess it. Is it in line with does the science or the numbers that you're promoting make sense? They then sign it off, and then you have a science-based target that you can showcase. And I do work with so many companies, showcase to your stakeholders, like the investors, to your customers. But increasingly, we're seeing companies setting these science-based targets to really also showcase the action that they're taking to their own staff, who are increasingly becoming much more interested in what the company's doing on climate change. So where does the UK stand on that? I am delighted to say that they're actually taking a bit of a leadership role, probably because we're hosting COP this year. The UK became the first country to reach a milestone of 100 companies committed to business ambition for 1.5, setting those 1.5 degree targets. Only 2 months later, the number has grown to 143 companies out of the 623 globally. Many of the largest UK companies setting this target are from the FTSE, so 39 from the FTSE 100. But let's just quickly look at the construction industry. Of the construction industry, we've seen Wilmot Dixon, Multiplex, Kier, Galliford Try. Actually, I'm not going to read these logos, they're on the screen for you. The biggest corporations, the biggest construction companies are taking that leadership role and setting a 1.5 degree target in the Race to Zero. This meets a lot of your stakeholder needs, and I would very much advocate, if you're not seeing your company's name or logo on the right hand side, to just ask your environmental team what they're doing, and if they're not, if they haven't got this on their agenda, they can reach out to CDP and we'll help them on that journey. So thank you for your time. I'll be here to answer any questions after this presentation.
Well, thanks very much to both Claire and Sonia for that fascinating presentation. And as Sonia mentioned at the end of that session, she's still here with us for questions, although Claire has disappeared. Sonia, I wanted to ask what your feeling was. I mean, the number of firms' logos that we saw during that presentation was very encouraging. Do you think we're getting to a tipping point where, you know, it's just going to be a part of being in business is to get your carbon plans, you know, audited and approved? You know, it's just going to be the price of entry. If you haven't got this kind of stuff in place, then you're nowhere. Is that the case?
We're not there yet, but that is the feeling that I'm starting to get. I mean, Claire talked a bit about the regulatory turnaround with the Biden administration, but when I talk to the C-suite, and I do interview quite a lot of the C-suite on why they're taking action on climate change, I'm seeing more and more pressure coming from all stakeholders. So the investors and the banks are the price of doing business. Their customers, and one thing that I didn't touch upon within my presentation is the amount of companies or purchasers or construction clients that are setting these targets that impact on the construction industry as a supplier. And interestingly enough, I've seen the likes of CBRE asking their suppliers for transparency. So we're seeing that cascade. And then the last bit, you mean the talking about the price of doing business, is talent retention. Now, previously, this is something that has been centered around the likes of Microsoft. And I don't know if you guys have seen, Greta Thunberg, or if you have kids and you went on a school strike. I know that a lot of my friends who have nothing to do with this industry were asked by their children to take them on a school strike. So it's coming home a bit more on that front from the youth angle, and they're coming into the job market. Now, previously, the likes of Apple, Microsoft, Google, you saw them take these big stands on climate change because of wanting to recruit the biggest talent out, straight out of MIT. This is broadened now. I was talking to a CEO of a big chemicals company in Switzerland, and asked him why he set his science-based target. And he started talking about HR and talent retention. So the price of doing business, the price of getting the right people into your business, it's starting to become, climate change is becoming the business as normal topic, if that makes sense. At least that's what we're hearing.
Indeed. One of the questions we had in an earlier session might be something that you can talk about. It was about how do we make sure that when people talk about net zero, that actually that's what is meant. I mean, there was a lot of press coverage for the first net zero office building in the UK earlier this year, and I think the UK Green Building Council came along a day later going, oh well, it's not actually net zero. Is that what CDP does? Help to eradicate that kind of sort of doublespeak?
Net zero it's a relatively new concept, and everyone's still working out what that means. But yes, transparency is key, and we saw this a long time ago, that there were companies making bold claims that didn't quite add up. It's within my industry, they call it greenwashing. And there are a few things to counteract that. The first is be transparent about everything you're doing, the assumptions you're making, what's, how you're accounting for this, what it covers. The second thing I would say is, particularly on the net zero front, the Race to Zero is a campaign, a reputable campaign. If you just Google it, it's associated with the COP for this year. There are a few different mechanisms to getting into it, but it has a minimum standard. So that's a really good framework there. I would recommend the Science Based Targets Initiative, because that is an initiative that's run by a series of not-for-profits and is very transparent on its methodology. It's linked to the WWF and others. But there are other ways, other mechanisms to get in, and you can actually apply to Race to Zero directly yourself, and you just have to be very clear with the claims that you're making. But from our perspective, yes, that was one of the roles we take. We encourage transparency, and because we have standardized disclosure, it means that we ask the tricky questions, such as, oh, did you include all of your operations when you created this emissions profile? Are there any emissions? To shed that transparency for a company that footprint may want to only footprint its 10 people in an office, in sales office in London, and leave out the factories in China, for instance. So that being clear and robust with methodologies and transparency of your coverage is very is core to anyone who's looking to take more action on this.
I'm going to squeeze in one final quick question. You mentioned 24 firms that in the construction sector that you'd approached to be involved with. Not all of them had responded. Is CDP open to anybody? Can smaller companies get in touch with you and work with you?
Yeah, it is open to everyone. We actually work with over 1,000 small to medium enterprises, and they're largely engaged through their purchases. But the other day I had, I nearly said their name, I'm not allowed to do that, an actual construction company based in London just write to a CDP and volunteer to disclose through not asked by investors, not asked by banks, not asked by customers, just because they wanted to disclose transparently, and alongside their peers, their privately owned firm. So anyone can. You can email us. You can email me. I will put my email in. Apologies, child's toy went off.
We can amend your profile on Swapcard if people want to do that, or they can indeed use the facilities of Swapcard to contact you directly.
Details. But anyone who wants to join in is more than welcome.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That's all the time we've got for today, I'm afraid. We've come to that point where I will need to wrap up. So thanks again very much, Sonia, and to Claire, who's now disappeared, for that fascinating session.